Hi there, I'm Dr. Jonathan Downey, and I love helping churches to become multilingual wherever you are in the world. One of the things I've noticed is that not every church is aware of the tools and the help available to help them do that, to help them build interpreting or translation or whatever it is in their church. So this is my updated presentation on the tools that are available. I've added new tools and presenting the information a little bit differently to help you make smart decisions. Before we get to the tools themselves, we have to talk about three areas that are far more important than we give them credit for. And those are vision, values, and strategy. I'm going to talk about the tools in a minute, but unless we talk about vision, values, and strategy first, unless we understand the importance of vision, values, and strategy, then all of the talk of tools will go to waste. I've seen churches with the best interpreting setup possible, but where that interpreting has lasted a few months or a few weeks even before stopping working. I knew one church which did everything correct to get the interpreting right, but forgot to buy French Bibles for those who are coming to know Jesus. So vision, values, and strategy really do work, and they are really important, and they will decide whether any provision that you put on actually works in the end. We can talk about vision, values, and strategy in three sets of questions. The first is, where are you now? Where are you in the world? Where are you financially? How many people in your church need some kind of language support? Is this something the church is interested in, or are people resisting it? What resources do you currently have? So finances, people, technology, expertise, experience. It's worth auditing your resources, saying, what talents and talented people do we have available? Do we have people who know how to set this stuff up? Do we have people who know how to deliver this? Do we have translators and interpreters in the church already? But most importantly, what kind of church do we want to have? After all, if there's no commitment to this, if it's just we have to look after these people who happen to be on our doorstep this week, then it's unlikely that any provision will last for the long term. Without commitment, language provision simply doesn't last, and it's seen as a cost rather than a benefit. Then we need to talk about what kinds of people do you want to welcome. Is your church really ready to welcome people from different backgrounds, from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, people who have different needs, people who have different forms of neurodiversity? Are there actual limits on the kind of people who would be welcome in your church? Now, we would all say, no, we are here for whosoever will. Whoever Jesus brings us, that's who we'll accept. But is that really true in your church? Is that really where your church is? Or realistically, do we need to talk to people about accepting those who are different from them, loving those who are different from them? What kinds of people do you want to welcome? Do you really want to welcome people from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds? It sounds like a question we shouldn't have to ask, but the reality is that we do. Which language provisions will allow you to welcome those people? Again, it's not about which language provisions we are comfortable offering, it's about which language provisions are needed to reach the people that God is giving us. It's never about our comfort, it's about where God is calling us to go. And then we need to talk about the implementation of the how, when, and who, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation. Finally, once you've put anything into place, you need to ask, how can we check for quality? How can we check that the provision that we're offering is actually good? I've lost count of the number of churches who say, it's fine, we just use Google Translator, Microsoft Translator. And when asked, how do you know it's good? Their response is, well, no one's complained. That's not a quality check. That's not a good way of checking that things are working. How can we make sure that support is there for people? How can we make sure that people providing language support or arranging Microsoft Translator or whatever are supported and helped and pastored? And finally, and this is the question that I think many churches stumble over, is, are we ready for multicultural and or multilingual leadership, especially when that is likely to mean some kind of change in the way the church works? That's possibly the hardest question to answer, and one that many churches are still thinking through, because multicultural leadership means giving over some power and some control to allow God to do a new thing in the church, even if it makes us slightly uncomfortable. I honour churches who are looking at that question and answering it and finding it hard to answer. That's fine. It's okay to find some questions harder to answer than others. So with that said, let's look at the major options. Well, the first option is to not have a church that's multilingual at all. I've heard of churches and I've come across churches where people say, well, everyone's going to have to learn English in our country anyway, so just put everything in English. And you can substitute that for your local language. Oh, just have everything in French, just have everything in German. These people are going to have to learn anyway. And we can understand the justification for that. And we have to say, well, it is the easiest option because it doesn't mean changing anything. It doesn't mean adjusting in any way, perhaps apart from putting on a few English classes. And there's nothing wrong with putting on English classes. But are we doing it for the right reason? Are we doing it because we want people to be able to exist and do well in the society that they're in? Or are we doing it because we want people to be like us? Because we want to be more comfortable? Because we want to have things our way? Having everything in English, even when we offer English classes, creates a barrier. It creates a caste or a class system between those for whom English is their first or native language and those for whom it isn't. It creates favouritism, partiality, as it's called in the book of James. And what does it say to others? We don't want to admit it, but realistically this option, it says more about us than it does about anyone or anything else. It says something about our hearts, about our readiness to sacrifice, about how far we are prepared to go to welcome people. The second option, and I've seen this become very common in the US, is that, well, let's just have different services in different languages. In fact, when I talk about multilingual church, most people assume this is what I'm talking about. It's not usually, but yeah. This does create space for everyone. It's much better than having everything in English because you say to people, look, we've created this space where you can feel at home. And it's your space and you can have the service in your language. Sounds good on the surface. But these spaces that we've created are separate spaces. We're not saying we're going to love and spend time with you. We're saying you go spend time with your people and we'll spend time with our people. This is something that Paul argued against vehemently in the book of Galatians. Equal but separate is not good Christian theology. There are three models to choose from if we want to do different services in different languages, and there are reasons why we may want to consider it. We could have the rental model, where a church from another culture rents space from an established church. This sounds like a financially good deal. It's always good to rent space from a church who understand what it means to be a church. And it can work. But it's entirely transactional and it's entirely financial, and the relationship goes no further than the passing of money. Well, what about space sharing? Perhaps two churches could share the same building together, they could co-own it, and they could share space. Sounds good on the surface. Sounds like an idea worth pursuing. But again, the relationship may go no further than just handing over keys. Well, what about co-leadership, where the churches are led by a single multicultural team? Well, of all of the options to have different services in different languages, this seems to be the best one. Where it's two churches from different backgrounds, from different languages, learning and sharing together. And this is good. This is what we want to be doing, even though it has its own challenges. So realistically, anything apart from co-leadership leads to the creation of new churches, and we're seeing that increasingly in the data from sociology of religion. Unless there's an intent to have co-leadership and an intent and a regular meeting together of the two churches, you have two churches. You don't have one church meeting in different languages. We see this in the data. So if we want to do this model, and there may be reasons why some churches want to consider it, lack of resources, or the two churches pre-existed and they're now coming together. If we want to do this model, co-leadership is the minimum level. And by co-leadership, I mean leadership at the same level. Not the white churches in charge and the white English churches in charge and the Spanish church are secondary. Or the French churches in charge and the Dutch church is secondary. No. Co-leadership, where the leaders decide and work together without any sense of hierarchy. That can be difficult when the church is in economically different positions. But when we have that level of co-leadership and when we intentionally have the two churches meeting together, you can build a single church that happens to meet in different languages. We still have to think about the theological issues about this and what we do about what Paul taught in Galatians, but we can have this model work, and there are places where it works fairly effectively. The problem is that it creates a risk of comfort with the norm. People just assume that the world around them is the world that there is. And increasingly in today's world where we're talking about racism and xenophobia, breaking that norm and helping people be comfortable with discomfort is important. Interaction is vital in the two churches. Well, what about using different languages in the same service? We get everyone there on a Sunday or a Saturday and we use different languages in the service. Well, there are lots and lots of good resources available to help us do this, and I'll point to some towards the end. We have Translated Songs as an organisation called Songs to Serve that offer translated songs and songs in different languages. Many denominations have bilingual liturgy. There are blessings in other languages. The resources are there to do this. It's entirely possible for any church of any size to grab the resources and do this. We could even use subtitling, so there are human ways of doing subtitles on the screen, usually called interlingual re-speaking, to give it its Sunday name. You can also do automatic subtitles. There are solutions available that will put subtitles in another language on the screen. So we can have different languages available during the same service. But, as with the previous option, we have to consider the politics of this and the theology of this. Why is this a political move? Well, having any language but the locally dominant language, so English in the UK and in many countries, Mandarin Chinese in China, French in France and so on, having any other language on stage, whether we're aware of it or not, is a political statement. We are saying we are giving place to this language even though it's not the dominant language of our country. In countries with more than one dominant language, it's a political statement to say we recognise the presence of people who speak different languages. Church decisions are political decisions whether we're aware of it or not. Then we have the theological angle of this. If we, for instance, are allowing people to pray in another language, but we're never having preaching in another language, our theology is saying this language is fit for communication to God, but not fit for communication between each other. If, for example, we sing a song in another language, but we're never happy to have the announcements in that language, then we're saying our church life exists in this language, and we'll have this other language on stage as a token. Now, I understand, and it is correct to say that every church is in a different place, and so it's better to do something than nothing. But whatever something we do with using different languages in the same service, we must never allow that to be the limit. We must never say, well, we'll never have preaching in your language, or we'll never have the blessing in your language. We must always say we're doing this intentionally as part of a longer process. We need to be aware of the unstated meanings of the way that we do multilingual services. This strategy is very useful in combination with others, such as combining it with having different services in different languages. Well, suddenly when you have a joint service and you have different languages on stage, that says something important. Think especially about language-based Bible studies. So, for example, there's nothing wrong and an awful lot right with having a multilingual Sunday service and Bible studies that are available in individual languages. We could use different languages on a Sunday and have individual language parenting groups, for example. Think of this as a both and strategy. It's not we're going to have language on a Sunday, but never anywhere else. This is a wonderful strategy to combine with others, so long as we are aware of the meaning, the assumed meaning of what it is we're doing. But what about relying on artificial intelligence or machine interpreting? We really shouldn't call it machine interpreting for reasons that I won't go into in this presentation, but people call it machine interpreting or automatic speech translation, or automated speech translation even. It's free, kind of. The free machine interpreting apps tend not to be the best machine interpreting apps, and they tend to be generic for the same reason that most free software is basically generic. So if we want software that's tuned to our church, that uses our vocabulary, our terminology, we're going to have to pay something for it. Results can be passable to good, kind of, because as it stands, intonation is not going to be given, and we have to know what it is we're looking for to check that it's okay. So I add the kind of there because there are horrible mistakes that can happen with machine interpreting, and they're not always predictable. I was in a church conference actually, who were lauding the availability of Microsoft Translator, and the speaker there said, I saw this restaurant that sold Bengali, Polish, German cuisine. I don't know what on earth they sold there. And Microsoft Translator said, I don't know what devil they sold there. The risks are quite high in some cases, especially if there's background noise or there are accents or words that may be quite unusual. With machine interpreting and AI, there are no need for volunteer or paid resources. Kind of. There's going to be setup time, there's going to be management time, there's going to be a time of checking that it's working, there's going to be some time that has to be invested to make sure this is actually doing the job. So it looks like it's free, but realistically no, because of its risks. Machine interpreting or automated speech translation does seem to lower perceived barriers. So people think it's easier to have a conversation when the technology's there. People tend to think it's easier to understand what's going on when there's a technological help. But this is both good and bad, because those systems can only translate language. They can't translate culture. So for example, they will quite happily tell you the Italian for, can I have pineapple on my pizza? They will not tell you that that is actually quite offensive to many Italians to ask for pineapple on your pizza. They have no cultural awareness, nor can they have cultural awareness, and so they will not help you if you get in a mess. And anyone who's travelled knows that it's possible to get in a mess. If it does go wrong, if there is a mistake, how would anyone know? How could anyone possibly know if we're bringing these things in because we don't understand the languages in the first place? So what methods could we use to check for mistakes? There are methods that we can use, there are ways that we can help, but this should be something that churches ask. If it goes wrong, how can we tell? How can we gather feedback if we don't know the language? What assurances can we have? And I can tell you that the vast majority of the commercial automated speech translation companies have a disclaimer in their contract saying they are not responsible for any damages caused by their system. So, how much trust should we put in them? It's a good question. Okay, this sounds like I'm heading towards this is the best option, and for some churches it is. You can use interpreters from your church. Interpreting tends to keep everyone in the same place and can foster community, and it can use for those who aren't even in the same place. In-house interpreters tend to be affordable because they tend to be volunteers. And they know how things work and how language is used. This is an underrated part of being an in-house interpreter. You know how the announcements are done. You know what happens every week. You know how the regular preachers deliver their sermons. You know the pat phrases used in the church. You'll know these things already. An incredibly underrated skill for interpreters to know. But choosing interpreters isn't easy, because simply having both languages doesn't mean that you're a good interpreter. It doesn't mean that you're even able to interpret, especially simultaneously. So how do we go about choosing interpreters? And this is a good question. It's one I'm happy to work with churches on. If they're looking at interpreting, I can help them choose a machine interpreting system from the previous option as well. But learning how to choose is a good exercise to carry out. And neither is it trivially easy to know if the interpreters are any good, because again, you don't have the languages. So how are you going to tell that they're good? These are good questions to ask. And it's, again, ones that I can work with churches on. Preparation and standards are still going to be important. It's going to be important, for example, to send sermon notes to interpreters ahead of time so that they know what's coming. Not asking one interpreter to do 3 hour long services week after week is going to be important. Having a team is going to be important. Understanding what helps interpreters stay mentally and physically healthy with their hearing and the atmosphere they're working in is still important. All of these things you still have to think about. How are we setting up our interpreters to do a really good job? We can't just assume that people have 2 languages, throw them into interpreting and let them get on with it. Although I know that is traditionally what has been done, with good and bad results. This leads to the issue of training. I do offer training for churches and for interpreters, and it's not just the interpreters who need training. Yes, there are basic training that we can do for interpreters, and if you're looking at interpreting, I highly recommend that you look into that. But the church needs training too. The preachers need training as well. One of the best things that we can do to learn to work with an interpreter is to do some of the basic training that interpreters have to do. Once we're aware of what's going on in an interpreter's brain, we make much better preachers. So let's do a little side note on interpreting to talk about the different ways that interpreting can be delivered in a church, since this is my specialism. Modes are the different delivery methods, if you like, the different setups. So the first is on-stage consecutive, where you have the preacher on stage and the interpreter stands next to them. Straightforward. It's very, very common in churches. That's how I first saw interpreting. You can do 1 to 2 languages maximum. You can do 1 language normally, 2 languages if you have a good sound tech team who know how to split the sound into different speakers. It's very good for visibility and for demonstrating your church's commitment to language provision. In fact, if there are only 1 or 2 languages needing interpreting, it's a really good place to start. This forced disturbance is a good thing. You don't need any equipment apart from perhaps an extra microphone. But it does make everything longer, and the most common complaint about on-stage consecutive is the fact that it makes everything longer. And for it to work and not bore everyone to tears, there needs to be some kind of rhythm or partnership built up between the preacher and the interpreter, and this takes time and practice. What about simultaneous interpreting? Well, instead of the preacher and interpreter taking turns, what about if the interpreter's interpreting while the preacher's still preaching? Simultaneous can have as many languages as you like. Depending on the system you're using, 100 languages is not a problem. The number of languages you need in your church will never exceed the amount of languages that can be delivered on a simultaneous system. That's just how they work. They're great for reducing disturbance. Only the people who need the interpreting will hear the interpreting in most cases. The equipment varies, but the minimum is 1 laptop per language unless you're doing whispered interpreting, which I'd rather that churches didn't do if they can get away with it, and some kind of receiver. So depending on the system, a smartphone, an infrared unit, however you want the interpreting to be received. The time is the same as an ordinary church service. The church service runs as normal with the interpreting going on in the background, but the interpreters will still need partnership from the speakers, and they will certainly still need preparation, especially if they are untrained volunteers. Whispered interpreting happens when the interpreter just whispers into someone's ear or into a group of people's ears. It's only suitable for a few people at a time, and it tends to disturb the service, so if possible, avoid whispered interpreting. But what about using professionals? So instead of using interpreters from your church, you can use professionals, and they do exist. There's a much lower volunteer time requirement. You send the professionals an email, you send them the sermon notes, they're ready to go. You get all the benefits of having interpreters from your church, but now the people delivering the interpreting are trained to do the job, so you don't need to worry as much about selection, you don't need to worry as much about quality and preparation. They know how to prepare. So there's a much lower need to train on technology or techniques, because if they're a professional interpreter, they know the technologies really well and they already have the techniques. You just say to them, can you interpret in our church? We're using live voice. Sure, no problem. Or can you interpret in our church? We're using Zoom Professional. Sure, I know that system, no problem, no need for training, just get on with it. But it is by far the most expensive option. We're talking about a minimum of £500 per language per service, and most professional interpreters will want 2 interpreters per service so that they can change over every 30 minutes. So that £500 £100 per language per service is about the bottom end. Preparation will be broader than in-house, so professional interpreters will want to look through previous services. They will want to see the style of how people preach. They will want to see how do you do announcements, how do you do transitions between different parts of the service. And so having previous services online will save a whole lot of time and give the interpreters a whole lot of good preparation to work from. And yes, they will still like to see your sermon notes if possible. You will still need quality checks, although professional interpreters tend to roughly quality check each other. But simply saying this person says they're a professional is not a good way of checking quality. There are all sorts of quality checks that you can do, but don't assume that just because you're paying for the interpreting that the interpreting is necessarily the best that you can get, or that there aren't ways that it can be improved. Professional interpreters should hear feedback from the people paying them and should be able to adjust their output accordingly. There is, however, a current shortage of trained professional church interpreters. There are quite a few, I know over 100, but there is still a shortage. It can be difficult to find trained professionals for certain languages for good reason. So for all of these realistic options, apart from just having English, everything just in English, for all of these options, no matter which you choose, there's going to be need for support, because there is no such thing as an ideal perfect option. It's what's best for your church. Looking at the questions that we started with, looking at the resources that you have, every option has pros and cons. There will be a need for pastoral support. Even if all someone is doing is setting up automated speech translation, machine interpreting, and hitting the go button, they will still need pastoral support because they will be getting some kind of feedback from the people using the service. Think about, how do you provide pastoral support? How do you provide help? How do you provide a place to talk for the people involved in language provision? That means practicing good communication. Not just saying, you're up next Sunday, on you go, or as I heard once, you're interpreting next Sunday, he's a fast, dense speaker, good luck. That's not good communication. How are you going to regularly meet with the people involved in language support? How are you going to make sure that there's some way of hearing from those who need this language support? How are you going to quality check? These are things that you need to think about as a church. Never let language provision become a side issue. Never let it become something that we do for those people over there because they need it. Well, actually, we need it because without language support, we can't communicate with the people coming into our church. Language support only really lasts in churches when it becomes a core of the church's identity. When it becomes, this is who we are as a church, so this is the price we're willing to pay. Is everyone behind the language support that you're offering? This goes back to vision, values, and strategy once again. Do you have the support of the congregation? Or are they complaining all the time about what's happening? Do the congregation understand why it exists? And do they see it as something for those people over there? Or something that's for all of the church, that helps all of the church, that's good for everyone? Now, where do you get help? There's different stages. There are no ideal solutions. Sometimes you need help finding the right solution for your church and working through it. And yes, I offer support for all solutions, even if it's ones that I don't think are ideal, because there are no ideal solutions. Churchinterpreting.com is your one-stop shop for anything to do with the interpreting side of Multilingual Church. I will put some more resources on the other options soon, but everything on that website is free and available for you to take away, print, use in your church. That's all free. If you're looking at interpreting, there are 3 solutions that I'm happy to recommend. There's Interaxio, who have a dedicated Houses of Worship project manager, so they're very good at finding professional interpreters for you. Interaxio is an online remote interpreting system, which allows you to beam the interpreting to people's phones or to anyone online. You can even add it to your YouTube feed. Similar to them is Live Voice. Live Voice is a much slimmer solution, but again, you can add it to your YouTube feed. You can beam the interpreted service to people's phones. Both Interaxio and Live Voice are used to working with churches, and I've worked with them before. They're very good. Finally, there's Spiffio. Spiffio is different in that it offers a whole range of solutions, both automated through machine interpreting and automated subtitling through any range of human solutions. Spiffio is run by a Christian, and Spiffio is one of these rare suppliers that offers everything. I would say to go to Spiffio with a very clear idea of what you want to deliver. So for example, do you want machine interpreting or human interpreting with machine interpreting available for other languages? Or are you looking for subtitling? When you go to them with a very clear idea of what you want, you're going to get a better level of service, and it's going to be a lot quicker for you to get what you're looking for. The book Multilingual Church, which you can also see on the screen, is my latest book. It goes through all of the options in detail and helps you walk through that perhaps as a leadership team or as an entire church. I recommend it especially for leadership use or for church use. A lot of the questions are there and it will take you step by step through all of the options. If you'd like any more specific help, my email address is on the screen. It's jonathan@integritylanguages.co.uk. Feel free to give me an email if you would like any help. I also offer consulting packages for churches. Thank you very much.